The moment the porcelain music box shattered on the marble floor, the world stopped. For 40 years, Linnea had been invisible, a woman whose worth was measured in the careful stitches she used to mend the frayed silks and yellowed lace of the wealthy. She was the mender, the fixer, the quiet shadow who made beautiful things whole again, while she herself went unnoticed. He was Lord Valerius, master of the sprawling, shadowed estate of Blackwood Manor, a man whose stillness was more terrifying than any rage, whose age was a subject of fearful whispers, and whose eyes held the cold, clear light of a winter star. They should never have occupied the same thought, let alone the same breath of stunned silence in a crowded ballroom. But what no one knew, least of all Linnea, was that the reclusive lord had spent centuries watching the world break things, and he had never once seen anyone look at the pieces with such immediate, instinctive tenderness. If you believe that the most overlooked soul can be the one to heal the deepest wound, type scene below, and let me tell you what happened next. To understand how she got there, you need to know about the cold. Not just the bite of winter that seeped through the stone walls of the Ashworth estate where she served, but the deeper cold of being dismissed. Linnea had lived with that chill for decades. Her hands, once nimble and celebrated for their delicate work on embroidery and lace, were now gnarled with age. The joints ached on damp mornings, and the skin was a roadmap of fine scars, old burns, and the silvered lines of a life spent in service. Mrs. Ashworth had made her pronouncement a month prior, her voice thin and sharp as a needle. "Your hands are not what they were, Linnea. We cannot trust our finest things to you any longer. You will assist the general staff from now on." It was a demotion that felt like an erasure. From a skilled artisan to a scullery assistant, just like that. She was to be present at the Valerius Gala not as a guest, of course, but as one of the anonymous figures meant to clear away glasses and remain unseen. And she had been perfectly unseen, a ghost in a gray dress, until the crash. A young lord, flushed with wine and self-importance, had gestured too broadly, knocking the delicate porcelain shepherdess from its pedestal. It exploded on the floor in a spray of white and gold fragments. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. Mrs. Ashworth looked as if she might faint from sheer second-hand horror. But Linnea did not gasp. She moved. It was an instinct honed over a lifetime. Before her mind could register the impropriety, her body was already in motion. She knelt on the cold marble, her old knees protesting, her gaze fixed on the wreckage. Her fingers, those same hands deemed too clumsy and old, hovered over the pieces. She saw not destruction, but a puzzle. A familiar ache of sympathy for the broken thing filled her chest. She saw the clean breaks, the points of impact, the way the gilt scrollwork could be realigned. Her mind was already working, her hands itching to begin. A shadow fell over her. The music, the chatter, the very hum of life in the grand ballroom had ceased. A profound silence descended, a silence so deep it felt like the bottom of a well. Linnea looked up, and her breath caught. Lord Valerius stood over her. He was a man carved from night and winter. Tall, impossibly still, with eyes the color of polished jet that seemed to absorb all the candlelight in the room and give none of it back. The cold that emanated from him was nothing like the damp chill of the manor. This was an ancient, absolute cold, the cold of the void between stars. His presence commanded not just attention, but submission. Every person in that room was frozen, caught in the web of his silent authority. His gaze was not on the panicked young lord who had caused the incident, nor on the horrified hosts. It was fixed entirely on her. On her, kneeling on the floor, on her worn, calloused hands hovering protectively over the porcelain shards. His voice, when it came, was low and resonant, like the tolling of a distant bell. It was a voice that held the weight of centuries. He did not speak to the crowd. He spoke only to her. "Can you fix it?" The question was so direct, so unexpected, it cut through her fear. She looked from his stark, unreadable face down to the broken shepherdess. She traced the line of a fracture with her gaze. She saw the work, the patience it would require. The world fell away, leaving only her, the broken object, and the intense focus of the man who owned it. She answered with the simple honesty that had defined her life. "I do not know, my lord," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the unnatural stillness. "But I can try. The breaks are clean. The heart of it is still there. A flicker of something, not warmth, but something less cold, passed through his dark eyes. It was a moment of profound and unnerving focus. He was not just looking at her. He was seeing her. He saw the threads of gray in her hair, the stoop of her shoulders, and the competent, steady calm in her old hands. He saw 40 years of quiet devotion to mending what others had carelessly broken. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then he raised his voice, and it carried to every corner of the vast room, without any effort at all. "My steward will arrange for this woman to be brought to my estate. She will be given whatever she requires for her work." A murmur of shock rippled through the guests. Mrs. Ashworth's face was a mask of disbelief and indignation. Linnea? Their clumsy old servant, chosen for a task of such importance? It was unthinkable. Lord Valerius's gaze swept over the crowd, and the murmuring died instantly. His eyes landed on the Ashworths, and for a moment, the temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. A candle flame near him guttered violently, though there was no draught. "She is under my protection now," he stated, the words less a declaration and more an unbreakable vow. He then turned and walked away, the shadows in the room seeming to deepen and stretch in his wake, pooling around his feet like loyal hounds. The spell was broken. The ballroom erupted in a frenzy of whispers, but Linnea heard none of it. She was still on her knees, her heart pounding a strange, new rhythm in her chest. For the first time in her life, she had not been dismissed. She had been chosen. The journey to Blackwood Manor was a silent, surreal dream. She was bundled into a carriage upholstered in dark velvet. The Valerius crest, a raven with a star in its beak, embossed on the doors. The steward, a man as silent and imposing as his master, had collected the porcelain fragments with the care of a surgeon while handling vital organs. Linnea sat with the velvet-lined box on her lap, her own few belongings tied in a simple cloth bundle at her feet. The estate was a fortress of granite and shadow, clinging to the side of a wind-swept mountain. It was not a home. It was a monument to time itself. Towers clawed at the perpetually gray sky, and gargoyles wept stone tears down walls stained black with age and rain. As the carriage passed through the immense iron gates, Linnea felt as though she were crossing a threshold into another world, a place where the rules of sunlight and warmth no longer applied. She was shown to a room in a quiet wing of the manor. It was larger than any room she had ever had to herself, with a small, stone-framed window overlooking a garden of pale, night-blooming flowers. The furniture was old but immaculately kept. There was a fire laid in the hearth, though it seemed to give off little heat against the pervasive chill of the house. It was clean, comfortable, and utterly lonely. For 2 days, she saw no one but a young maid who brought her meals on a silver tray and addressed her as Miss Linnea, with a respectful dip of her head that was utterly bewildering. Linnea spent the time carefully laying out the porcelain fragments on a dark cloth, studying them, memorizing their shapes, planning the meticulous process of their reunion. The work centered her, calmed the frantic beating of her heart. It was a language she understood. On the evening of the third day, there was a soft knock on her door. It was the steward. "Lord Valerius requests your presence," he said, his face impassive. He led her not to a drawing room or a study, but deep into the heart of the manor, through corridors that grew progressively older and colder. The air grew thick with the scent of dust, decaying paper, and something else, something like dry earth and old stone. He stopped before a pair of massive oak doors bound in iron. He pushed them open, and the scent washed over her in a wave. He gestured for her to enter, and then, with a soft click, closed the doors behind her, leaving her alone in the vast, echoing space. Linnea stood in awe. She was in a library, but it was unlike any she had ever imagined. It was a cathedral of forgotten knowledge. Shelves soared 2 stories high into the vaulted darkness, crammed with books of all shapes and sizes. Scrolls were piled in corners, their edges brittle and crumbling. Maps, yellowed and fragile, were laid out on massive tables. But it was not a library of pristine, cared-for volumes. It was a tomb. Dust lay thick as velvet on every surface. The air was stagnant and cold. The spines of books were cracked and broken, their leather bindings peeling away like sunburnt skin. Pages had come loose, fluttering to the floor like dead leaves. It was a place of profound decay, a treasure trove on the brink of turning to dust. And in the center of it all, standing beside a table where a single candelabra cast a pool of flickering light, was Lord Valerius. The shadows clung to him, making it seem as if the darkness of the room was an extension of his own form. "The music box," he said, his voice quiet but filling the immense space. "It is a trifle. A test." Linnea's hands clenched at her sides. "A test, my lord?" "I needed to see if the whispers were true. If there was still someone left in this world who knew how to mend things not for their value, but for their own sake. Someone with patience." He gestured to the room around them, a sweep of his long-fingered hand that encompassed the towering shelves of ruin. "This is my real affliction, my history, my memory." He picked up a small, leather-bound book from the table. It was so fragile that the cover threatened to disintegrate under his touch. This diary was written by a Venetian merchant in the 15th century. It describes the color of the sky on the day his daughter was born. The paper is crumbling. The ink is fading. Soon, the sky on that day will be gone forever. I was there. I remember it. But when this book turns to dust, will the memory still be real? He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw past the cold authority. She saw a flicker of something ancient and desolate, a profound, soul-deep loneliness. He was not a man. He was a living archive, and his collection was turning to dust. "I have amassed these things over a very long time," he continued, his voice a low murmur. "Each one is a piece of a life I lived, a moment I witnessed. But time is a relentless thief. It gnaws at paper and leather and thread. I can command men. I can move faster than a blink. I can live while empires rise and fall. But I cannot stop this." He gestured again to the decay. "I cannot hold back the dust." He stepped closer, his dark eyes boring into hers. The cold intensified, and the candles flickered, their flames dancing as if in a gale. The world values what is new, what is shiny, what is whole. It discards what is old and worn. The Ashworths discarded you because your hands showed the marks of time. They saw weakness. I see a lifetime of expertise. They saw your age as an ending. I see it as proof of your skill. He paused, his gaze dropping to her hands. I do not need a servant, Linnea. I need a curator, a conservator, a historian. I need someone to save my memories from oblivion. I need your hands. I need your patience. I need the care I saw you give to that broken toy on the ballroom floor. The truth of it settled over her, vast and terrifying and strangely exhilarating. He had not chosen her to fix a trinket. He had chosen her to restore a life, to hold centuries in her hands and piece them back together. It was an impossible, monumental task. A life's work offered to a woman who had been told her working life was over. Would you have stayed when you realized the scale of the task was not to fix one broken thing, but to save 1,000 forgotten memories? Tell me in the comments, and if you are not subscribed yet, join this family. Linnea looked around the cavernous, dying library. She saw the mountains of work, the years it would take. She felt the oppressive cold, the weight of the silence, the profound isolation of the task. She should have been afraid. She should have been overwhelmed. And a part of her was. But another, deeper part of her, a part that had been dormant for years, began to stir. This was not a demotion. This was a coronation. Here, in this place of endings, she was being offered a new beginning. She was not being asked to be invisible. She was being asked to be the one person who could truly see. She met his gaze, her own clear and steady. Where do I begin, my lord? A slow, almost imperceptible change occurred in his expression. The tension in his shoulders eased. The absolute stillness that surrounded him seemed to soften at the edges. For the first time, he looked less like a monument and more like a man who had been carrying an impossible weight alone for far too long. You begin, he said so softly, wherever you wish. And so her new life began. The manor provided her with a workshop adjacent to the library, a room with a large northern window that let in a steady, shadowless light. At her request, they brought her fine tools, delicate brushes, archival glues, and bolts of silk and linen thread in every conceivable color. She started with the music box, a simple task to steady her hands and mind. She worked for days, patiently cleaning each fragment, aligning the delicate pieces, her touch sure and practiced. The porcelain shepherdess slowly, piece by piece, became whole again under her care. When she was finished, only a network of fine, gold-filled cracks showed where it had been broken, a testament to its survival, not its damage. When she presented it to Lord Valerius, he merely glanced at it, his focus on the way her hands cradled the object. Your work is as they said it was, he noted, a simple statement that held more praise than all of Mrs. Ashworth's flowery compliments ever had. Then, she turned her attention to the library. She chose a small corner to start, a single shelf of water-damaged botanical texts. The work was slow, painstaking. She spent her days hunched over brittle pages, carefully separating them, cleaning away centuries of grime and mold, reinforcing the bindings with new thread. The silence of the library became her companion. It was a living silence, filled with the whisper of turning pages and the soft scrape of her tools. Lord Valerius was a constant, unobtrusive presence. He would sit for hours in a high-backed chair in the shadows, reading from one of the few books still intact, or sometimes simply watching her. He never spoke, never interrupted, but she was always aware of him. His stillness was a weight in the room, a silent anchor. The air was always colder where he sat, and the candlelight seemed to bend towards him. One afternoon, as she was meticulously repairing the spine of a 17th-century atlas, he finally spoke. "That scar," he said, his voice startling her out of her deep concentration. "On your thumb. How did you get it?" Linnea paused, looking down at the small, silvery crescent near her nail. It was an old mark, one she'd long forgotten. "A child's doll, my lord. A little girl, the Ashworth's niece. She had a porcelain doll her mother had forbidden her to play with. Of course she did, and she broke its arm clean off. She was terrified." She smiled faintly at the memory. "She brought it to me in secret, her eyes wide with tears. While I was setting the arm, a sharp edge of the porcelain slipped. It was a deep cut." "And did you fix the doll?" he asked, his dark eyes intent. "I did," Linnea said. "I told the little girl the doll had simply been on an adventure and gotten a scrape, just like she sometimes did. I painted a tiny flowered bandage over the crack in its arm. The girl was delighted. She said it made the doll braver." Valerius was silent for a long moment. "You did not see it as broken. You saw it as having a story." "Everything has a story, my lord," she said simply, returning to her work. "Sometimes the breaks are part of it." Their conversations became a quiet ritual in the long afternoons. He would ask her about the things she had mended, and she would tell him the small human stories attached to them. The lace veil torn on a wedding day, the favorite book of a boy gone to war, the silk fan snapped in a moment of anger. She gave him glimpses into the fleeting, fragile lives she had brushed up against, the lives he had watched pass by like seasons from his lonely perch. In return, he began to share fragments of his own. As she worked on a crumbling sheaf of parchment, he might murmur, "That ink was made with oak galls from a forest that no longer exists. I watched them harvest it." While she reinforced the binding of a book of star charts, he told her of watching those same constellations from the deck of a ship on a black, silent sea, before the world was filled with engine noise and electric light. He never spoke of himself, only of the world he had witnessed. He was the eternal observer, and she, for the first time, was his sole audience. One evening, exhaustion claimed her. She had been working for 12 hours straight, trying to save a collection of pressed flowers whose pages were turning to dust. The delicate task required absolute focus, and she had pushed herself too far. Her head drooped, and she fell asleep right there at the workbench, her cheek resting on a vellum page describing a species of rose that had been extinct for 200 years. She awoke with a start, not to the cold of the library, but to a strange, enveloping warmth. A heavy weight was draped over her shoulders. It was Lord Valerius's cloak, a thing of thick, black wool that smelled of night air and pine smoke. He was standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit garden of pale flowers. The shadows in the room seemed subdued, held at bay by his proximity to her. They pooled in the far corners, leaving the space around her workbench strangely clear. She sat up, pulling the cloak tighter around herself. It was impossibly warm, holding a deep, resonant heat that seemed to seep into her bones, chasing away the familiar ache in her joints. "My lord," she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. "I am sorry. I did not mean to." He turned from the window, his face unreadable in the dim light. "Rest is not a failure, Linnea." He walked back towards her, his footsteps making no sound on the stone floor. "You work too hard. You give too much of yourself to these broken things." "It is my purpose," she answered simply. "It is," he agreed. He stopped before her, looking down at where she sat. "But you must preserve yourself as well. You are more valuable than any book on these shelves." The sincerity in his voice was a physical blow. No one had ever called her valuable. Useful, yes. Competent once. But never valuable. A strange heat bloomed in her chest, a feeling so foreign she could not name it. The nights grew colder as autumn deepened into winter. Frost sketched delicate ferns on the workshop window panes. The ache in Linnea's hands became a constant, throbbing companion. Some mornings she struggled to even close her fingers into a fist, the joints swollen and stiff. She would soak them in hot water, but the relief was always fleeting. One such evening she was struggling to thread a fine needle, her fingers refusing to cooperate. She winced, dropping the needle for the third time. A frustrated sigh escaped her lips. Suddenly, he was there, standing beside her chair. She hadn't heard him approach. "Your hands are paining you," he stated. It was not a question. "It is the cold, my lord. An old complaint," she said, trying to dismiss it, embarrassed by her body's betrayal. He did not move away. Instead, he reached out and, with a gentleness that seemed utterly at odds with his formidable presence, he took her right hand in his. She flinched, expecting the icy cold she always felt when he was near. But his hand was not cold. It was warm. No, it was more than warm. It was a deep, penetrating heat, like a stone that had baked in the sun for 1,000 years. The warmth was shocking, a vital, living thing against her chilled skin. It radiated from his palm into hers, a steady, pulsing energy that seemed to melt the stiffness in her joints, easing the deep ache in her bones. She stared at their joined hands. His was long and pale, unnaturally so, but it was wrapped around her own gnarled, work-worn hand with an impossible tenderness. He held it as if it were the most precious artifact in his entire collection. "How?" she breathed, unable to comprehend the sensation. "There are some advantages to a long life," he said, his voice a low murmur. His thumb moved slowly over her knuckles, tracing the raised veins and calluses. "You spend your days warming the past, Linnea. It is only right that someone should warm you." She looked up at his face. His eyes, usually so dark and distant, held a focused intensity, a raw vulnerability she had never seen before. In that moment, the chasm between them, of age, of station, of species, seemed to vanish. There was only the silent library, the flickering candlelight, and the profound, impossible heat flowing from his hand into hers. The great and powerful vampire king, a being of cold and shadow, was pouring his own strange life force into her to ease her simple, mortal pain. This became their new ritual. Every evening, when the cold was at its worst, he would come and take her hands in his, holding them until the pain subsided and her fingers were nimble once more. They rarely spoke during these moments. Words were unnecessary. The quiet intimacy of the act, the simple, profound gift of his warmth, forged a bond between them stronger than any vow. It was during one of these quiet evenings that she pricked her finger on an old book clasp. A single, perfect drop of crimson welled on her fingertip. Before it could fall, he was moving. He moved with a speed that was not human, a blur of shadow and form that was there and then here. He was kneeling before her, his hand clamping down on her wrist, his body radiating a tension that was terrifying in its intensity. His head was bowed, but she saw his eyes. For a fleeting, horrifying second, they were not black. They were glowing, a deep, predatory red. The shadows in the room writhed, coalescing around him, their edges sharp and hungry. The ancient cold returned, 1,000 times stronger, a blast of absolute zero that stole her breath. She saw the predator then, the ancient hunger that lived behind the man's courtly facade. She felt the immense, terrifying power he kept so carefully leashed, but his grip on her wrist, though iron-strong, was not painful. And as she watched, she saw the battle being waged within him. She saw the crimson light in his eyes flicker and recede, consumed by the familiar darkness. She saw the muscles in his jaw clench with the force of his control. The shadows settled. The terrible cold lessened. He released her wrist as if it had burned him. He stood and turned away, his back rigid. "Forgive me," he said, his voice strained, harsh. Linnea looked at her finger. The drop of blood was still there. She calmly reached for a cloth and wiped it away. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but it was not entirely from fear. She had seen the beast, but she had also seen the man who controlled it, and he had controlled it for her. "There is nothing to forgive," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "You did not harm me." He turned back to her slowly, his face a pale mask of self-loathing. "I could have." "But you did not," she insisted, meeting his haunted gaze. "That is what matters." In that moment, she understood. His loneliness was not just about time. It was about his nature. He was a creature of immense power and terrible appetite, forced to live at a careful distance from the fragile world he cherished. He collected memories in books and objects because he could not risk making them with living people. Until now. The news of Linnea's new position eventually filtered back to the world beyond Blackwood's gates. It was met with scorn and disbelief, particularly by the Ashworths. Humiliated by the public rebuke at the gala, they could not accept that their discarded servant had been elevated so highly. Malice, fueled by envy, began to fester. They started to spread rumors. At first, they were whispers in drawing rooms, then bolder statements in town. They said Linnea was a charlatan, a mad old woman who had somehow bewitched the reclusive and eccentric Lord Valerius. They suggested she had stolen the music box, not mended it, and was now living like a queen on his misplaced charity. Mr. Ashworth, a man of some local influence, decided to take matters into his own hands. He would expose her and reclaim his family's honor. One bitter winter afternoon, a carriage bearing the Ashworth crest rolled up the long, winding drive to Blackwood Manor, followed closely by 2 local constables on horseback. They were met at the massive front doors by the silent steward. Mr. Ashworth puffed out his chest. "We are here on official business. We have reason to believe you are harboring a thief, a woman named Linnea. We have a warrant to search her rooms and return stolen property." The steward did not even blink. He simply turned and disappeared into the gloom of the entrance hall. Moments later, Lord Valerius appeared. He was not dressed for receiving guests. He wore the simple, dark clothes he favored in the library. But his presence was more commanding than any king in royal finery. The air around him shimmered with cold. "Mr. Ashworth," Valerius said, his voice dangerously soft, "you are trespassing." "I am here with the law," Ashworth blustered, gesturing to the nervous-looking constables, "to reclaim what is mine and expose a fraud." Linnea had heard the commotion from the library. Her heart seized with a familiar, sickening dread. Shame and fear, emotions she thought she had left behind, washed over her. She hurried to the entrance hall, arriving just in time to hear Ashworth's accusation. "She is a common thief who has preyed on your grief and isolation, my lord." All eyes turned to her. She felt herself shrink, the years of being made to feel small and worthless rushing back. She saw the smug triumph on Mrs. Ashworth's face, the suspicion in the constable's eyes. But then she looked at Valerius. He was not looking at the Ashworths. He was looking at her. And in his eyes, there was no doubt, no suspicion. There was only a calm, protective fury that was more terrifying than any open rage. He stepped forward slightly, placing himself between Linnea and her accusers. "The only thief here," Valerius said, his voice dropping to a glacial whisper, "is a man who stole 40 years of a woman's life and then discarded her when he decided she was no longer of use." His gaze locked onto Ashworth, and it was like being pinned by shards of ice. "You speak of value. Let us speak of value. Tell me, Mr. Ashworth, what did you pay for the 17th century Flemish tapestry that hung, stained and torn, in your back hallway for 50 years? Ashworth paled. "That old rag? It was worthless. We used it to cover a drafty wall." "Indeed," Valerius said. A cruel smile touched his lips. "You used a priceless historical artifact, a piece depicting the siege of Amarante, long thought lost, to stop a draft, because you were too ignorant to see its worth." He gestured to the steward, who stepped forward and with another servant unrolled a massive tapestry. It glowed with restored color, the threads of silver and gold gleaming in the dim light. The tear that had marred its center was gone, seamlessly rewoven. The stains had vanished. It was magnificent, a masterpiece brought back from the dead. "Linnea has spent the last month restoring it," Valerius announced to the stunned hall. She recognized it for what it was. Her knowledge, her skill, her sight, things you deemed worthless, have preserved a piece of history your ignorance nearly destroyed. He took a step toward the Ashworths. The shadows in the hall deepened dramatically, stretching and twisting. The constables instinctively took a step back, their hands going to their belts. "You come into my home and accuse this woman of theft?" Valerius's voice was now a low growl. "She is the curator of the Valerius archives. Her position in this house is second only to my own. She is not your servant to be bullied and discarded. She is a treasure, and you are nothing but common vandals." He raised a hand, and a sudden, violent gust of wind swept through the hall, though the massive doors were closed. It slammed into the Ashworths, making them stagger. The warrant fluttered from the constable's hand and skittered across the floor. "Leave," the Vampire King commanded, the words echoing with an ancient power that vibrated in the very stones of the manor. "And never return. If you ever speak her name again with anything but the utmost respect, you will find that my memory is very, very long." The Ashworths and the constables scrambled out of the hall, their faces white with terror. They fled, leaving the tapestry glowing in the hall behind them. The silence that descended was absolute. Linnea stood, trembling, staring at the man who had just defended her with such terrifying finality. He had not just protected her, he had vindicated her. He had taken her old wound, the source of her deepest shame, and transformed it into a mark of honor in front of the very people who had inflicted it. He turned to her, the unnatural cold and the writhing shadows receding as his anger subsided. His face was calm again, his eyes dark and gentle. He walked to her, and in the middle of the great hall, he took her worn hands in his. You are not invisible anymore, Linnea, he said softly. A year passed. Winter gave way to a brief, vibrant spring in the manor's gardens, then a lush summer, and returned again to the crisp melancholy of autumn. The library was no longer a tomb. Under Linnea's care, it was slowly coming back to life. Order emerged from the chaos. Shelves were cleaned, books repaired, scrolls carefully preserved. The scent of dust and decay was now mingled with the clean smell of lemon oil and beeswax. It had become a place of quiet, shared purpose. Linnea's life had transformed. The ache in her hands was a distant memory, banished by the nightly ritual of his warmth. She had her own suite of rooms, filled with books and comforts. The staff treated her with a reverence that still sometimes startled her. She was no longer Linnea the mender. She was the lady curator, the keeper of the manor's heart. But more than that, she was no longer lonely. Her days were filled with the quiet companionship of the man who had seen her when no one else had. They were a strange pair, the mortal woman whose life was measured in seasons, and the immortal being whose life was measured in ages. But in the quiet sanctuary of the library, they were simply Valerius and Linnea. One evening, as they sat by the fire he now insisted on keeping lit in the library, he looked at her across the small table where they often shared a late meal. The firelight softened the stark planes of his face, making him look younger, less formidable. "Are you happy here, Linnea?" he asked, the question simple but holding immense weight. She looked around the room at the rows of restored books that were a testament to their year together. She felt the comfortable warmth of the room, a warmth that now seemed to emanate from him as much as from the fire. "I have never known what it was to be happy," she answered honestly. "But I know what it is to have a purpose, to be valued. I have that here." He nodded, accepting her answer. He was silent for a long time, watching the flames dance. "The winter will be hard this year," he said finally. "And the one after, harder still. Time is a gentle friend to these books now, thanks to you, but it is not so kind to people." She knew what he was asking. The unspoken question hung in the air between them. Her hair was more silver now, the lines on her face a little deeper. Her life was a candle flame, flickering brightly, but destined to be consumed. His was a star, fixed and eternal. "I am an old woman, Valerius," she said softly. "I have made my peace with that." "Have you?" he countered, his gaze intense. "Or have you simply never been given a choice in the matter?" He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. The familiar vital heat flowed into her. "I have spent centuries alone. I had resigned myself to it. And then you walked into my life, and you began to mend more than just my books. You are mending me." He paused, and the vulnerability in his eyes was breathtaking. "I will not force you. I will not command you. But I am offering you a choice, an eternity of seasons by my side, to watch the world turn together." Linnea looked at their joined hands, his pale and perfect, hers scarred and aged. They were a map of two vastly different lives that had, against all odds, found a common path. She thought of the cold, the invisibility, the slow erasure of her former life, and she thought of the warmth, the purpose, the profound feeling of being truly, completely seen that she had found here. She did not give him her answer in words. She simply turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. A slow, genuine smile, the first she had seen, transformed his face, chasing away the last of the ancient shadows. The choice was made. Their story was no longer about endings, but about a beginning that had no end. For more stories where quiet compassion conquers centuries of loneliness, and where a lifetime of hidden skill becomes a key to immortality, subscribe to Herb Files. So tell me, would you have stayed? Comment where you are listening from tonight. I stay up until my eyes burn to bring you these stories. If this one touched you, do not break my heart. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one.